Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1299 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday, and today's show is myself and Glen Willis of Peachtree Hoops talking in two-part fashion. This is part one of two on Trey Young. I sort of teased this for the last couple of months, basically. Trey Young has been the white whale of this podcast. No, I'm kidding in some ways, but Glen and I talked a lot earlier in the summer about all kinds of players on the Hawks roster in capsule fashion. We saved Trey for the end, and it's a two-parter across 1299 and episode 1300, which is dropping at the same time. So this is part one you're about to listen to. Glenn and I talking mostly about Trey last season and what he was able to put on tape, stats, all that fun stuff. And then part two is a little bit more about future-facing stuff with how he fits with Murray, etc. But please subscribe to the podcast and keep it locked here. Again, part two is available right now. So without further delay, here is myself and Glenn, part one on Trey Young.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
I am joined now, as I am relatively often, by my friend Glen Willis. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, Brad?
I'm well. We're into the later form of August at this point. We're still, a month or so from Media Day as we're recording this. And then the Hawks kind of have a weird preseason, actually, where they have to go far, far away to play in Abu Dhabi against the Bucks a couple times. So kind of a weird lead up to the season that's coming. But we're still like a month away from the actual crush of the season. And of course, we've teased this for a long time. Most of our conversation today is going to be about Trey Young, which we were supposed to do like 3 months ago and just never did, in very on-brand fashion. And I will say, just at the top here, Glenn was gracious enough to join me for a lot of time to talk about all the players on the Hawks roster in capsule fashion, and we held Trey to the very end. By the way, those are still available to listen to and watch right now in your podcast player of choice, so I recommend that. But we held Trey to the very end, knowing full well that not a whole lot would change with Trey. But I will say, with the DeJounte Murray piece, we kind of got lucky because a little not that Trey has changed, but the situation has changed considerably, and we'll touch on that as well. But before we get to that, I want to know kind of where your head is with the Hawks. Obviously, it's been a little bit since you've talked with me in this form. Not a lot has changed. They kind of added on the margins. Trent Forrest was the most recent transaction, but how are we feeling here in late August?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't pay nearly as much attention to sort of betting lines and over-unders and things like that. But the result of my kind of casually looking through what those are and what I might bet, I think probably the last 6 years I've wagered one or two on overs. And I just happen to be somewhere where it's legal to do that. But, I mean, they seem to be nailing kind of the Hawks, I think, kind of median outcome that I expect is that 45 to 47 kind of win range as they're currently constructed. There are some things that they could do to potentially kind of push themselves up higher. They have built a lot more kind of defensive depth on the second unit, and then their kind of veteran bench depth is more. It's a more defensive oriented group. How will that kind of offset the losses that are on the offensive side? That's to me the kind of the really big variable, taking a broad view at the roster. So that's interesting to me. But I continue to be concerned about them not really having a third point guard behind Trey and DeJounte. I don't think that's ideal at all. I don't view Aaron Holiday as a point guard at all. There's still time to potentially kind of make a move on the margin to find someone that could come in and give them some minutes there. I think it's really, really important that they do that. But a lot of times when you're looking at that level of your roster depth, when teams cut from 20 to 15 right ahead of the season, so really viable guys can kind of come free. So I'm gonna just kind of wait and see if that's something that they add. So the big questions are sort of point guard depth behind Trey DeJounte, because you expect them to play on the court a lot together, even if they set up for staggering those two quite a bit. Also, and then the power forward depth. How does that get worked out? How much does Hunter play there? How much does Jalen play this year? How much does AJ play this year, and how does that affect sort of the wing / power forward kind of position rotation? That's a very ambiguous thing for me to kind of try to get my head around right now. So they're going to be a fun team, I think, again. But those are the things that I'm kind of keeping my eye on to see if I feel like they might push up towards where I see them as a viable, say, 50-win team, or if they kind of stay more in that mid-40s range. So that's kind of how I'm feeling right now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're going to touch on a lot of stuff as well as preseason gets going and training camp gets going, and we kind of had that nice little respite last week when the schedule came out, just for some free content along the way. I know our friend Grant Chappell always does a nice schedule breakdown for Peachtree Hoops that was good to sort of sift through. I talked about my kind of top 10, 15 games I'm looking for. I'm not going to make you do that, Glenn, especially because we could spend half the show, of course, on DeJounte Murray and Paulo Banchero in the second half of the season.
And I'm in Seattle, so
right
there's
up
been
your
a
alley.
lot of pro-am action out here that I've accessed, and none of it. I was actually out of town when Trey and JC came through, and I didn't know anything about the DeJounte Paulo thing until after it happened, and then LeBron was here yesterday.
They seemingly made up also. Apparently, at least there was one video of DeJounte and Paulo kind of looking like they were okay on the court yesterday or the day before as we recorded this over the weekend. So I think our national nightmare is over on that front, but we'll see.
Oh, my stress level can go down from 0.5 to 0.3 because I did not get spun up about that.
If there's anything people want to hear is from me and you, it's talk about pro and basketball. So no, we can move on from there. But I figured we'd start there. And the schedule, I will say, I said this a little bit before, but in case we have people that are listening to this podcast that we're not listening to the last couple, it's relatively favorable. Like there's only so much you can change about an NBA schedule. Like there are little things you can kind of tweak on the margins, road trips, when the West Coast trips are, also like who you don't play in the East 4 times versus 3. And like all those factors are like kind of kind to the Hawks on paper this time around, which is nice. I mean, that might only be worth like one win over the course of the season, maybe something like that. But it's better than having a bad schedule. So like if you're looking on the margins, and you mentioned the win totals and stuff like that, I know our friends at BetOnline are like in the 46 range or something like that. And I've kind of been not surprised, but it seems like there's a little bit of like negative push. I'm someone who looks at the betting markets quite a bit. The Hawks number has come down a few different places. And I was like kind of not surprised, but a little bit surprised by that. Just like, okay, I thought, typically a team that kind of runs it back and adds a high profile player, you're gonna get that little bump. I know Hawks fans are expecting a lot more from the Hawks than they had last year, which I understand when you add Murray, et cetera, but not so much nationally. There's not been so much more buzz. So I'm interested to see if that like comes around. They do have that showcase at the beginning of the preseason with the trip to the UAE to play the Bucks. Of course, the chance from 2 years ago, a little bit of more high profile there. But aside from DeJounte getting some funny headlines along the pro-am circuit, not a whole lot going on like national buzz wise.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Trey obviously here in a bit.
We are.
The big picture thing is like how much can they elevate their defense with the roster changes they made. That to me will impact their win outcome. Can they push towards league average, right?
Oh yeah.
Could they somehow get a little ahead of that? That seems unrealistic, but not completely impossible. Or are they going to stay in that bottom 10? That to me is the difference between, say, a 43-win team and a 48 or 49-win team, or if you could push even higher, maybe getting to 50-51 or something like that. So it's going to be interesting to see, how much switching they do with this group, how much drop they stick with or go away from, so that's where my head goes and stuff like that. And that's what I'll be kind of paying attention to early in the season is how are they setting up to potentially kind of push themselves up towards the middle of the pack. If they can get to within range of league average, I think 48, 49 wins is pretty realistic. If they stay at that bottom 10, I think it's next to impossible to get past about 45 or so.
Makes sense to me, and we'll touch on that, of course, as we get going here with Trey. Before we get to our Trey Young deep dive, a word from our sponsors on the show today. Today's show is brought to you by Rocket Money. Are you sick of managing your finances with buggy spreadsheets, or do you have an inbox that's overflowing with bills, or you're simply afraid to check your actual bank statement? If any of those actually apply to you right now, it's time to take back control of your financial life with Rocket Money, which is formerly Truebill, our favorite financial app. So why did Truebill change its name to Rocket Money? We'll tell you. Truebill is now backed by Rocket Companies and has grown from the bill management app into a full-on personal finance empowerment tool that helps more than 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and much more. That saves members of Truebill and now Rocket Money on average $700 per year. And with all of that comes the next evolution in Truebill's story, of course, and that is a new name. Bottom line, Rocket Money is everything that we already loved about Truebill with a fresh look and a fresh feel. Start canceling those unused or unwanted subscriptions right now at rocketmoney.com/LockedOnNBA or download the app from the Apple Store or the Google Play Store at this point in time. One more time, that is rocketmoney.com/lockedonnba. All right, Glenn, let us discuss Trey Young, what we're all here for at this stage. And clearly we all recognize this. He is very good. Last year, I don't know if you agree with me on this. I think you probably do. But I think last year he individually was arguably the best he's ever been. And I'm not sure people really noticed that because of the Hawks' struggles throughout the season. The fact they had to kind of get hot late to even get into the play-in, et cetera. But, individually, we can go through the numbers and stuff like that. But broadly speaking, I want to know what you kind of thought of Trey's performance last year. We'll sort of dive in from there. But personally, for me, I thought he was pretty awesome throughout the season, and kind of in the ways you'd expect. But still, like, you can certainly argue it was best that he's actually ever been individually.
Totally agree. I think it was his best season. He keeps getting better every year. He adds to his game every year. I don't think there's any kind of argument about his work ethic and how much he works on his game and all of that. What's I think most impressive to me is that his workload got the mix of what he was doing got a lot harder last year as opposing defenses stopped dropping against him and they started switching and trapping and really kind of bringing more defensive presence up the floor he had to deal with. I this morning as I was prepping, I was like, I wrote his season review for Peachtree Hoops. It felt like it was
long ago, yeah,
6 months ago. But a couple of things I noted there was that his workload in isolation almost tripled, 293% increase.
Wow.
And so that tells you a ton. He generated more 3-point attempts off the dribble than any other player in the league. And he was one of the best catch and shoot players in the league. So when you kind of take a look at the fact that so much of his work came in isolation, and for a guy his size, it's pretty crazy, like how viable that was. Now, when you look at a team that's second in the league in offense, and you look at the offensive rating on the cumulative set of possessions that he was up, working in isolation, that's about 10 points lower than their normal kind of offensive rating. But when your expectations are out, what one can get in isolation is a bit lower. But so with the fact that he chewed up drop coverage his first 3 seasons in the league, right? That incrementally disappeared across this past season. So a lot of the stuff that wasn't there, he seems to have anticipated that to some degree because he worked so much on his mid-range. He talked openly across the whole season with the media that was a focus for him last offseason. And so for him to run it back with these changes and still produce the overall production and efficiency that he did is pretty wild. And I think there's not that many players that could do that.
Oh, for sure. And I think that we'll kind of save this to the end, but there's a lot to talk about, like how his game might change with the new roster around him, mostly Murray, and how the impact of that is. But as far as like last season is concerned, I mean, you can't fake the uptick that he did across the board. You mentioned those specialized numbers with regard to isolations and catch and shoot stuff, but even just like the raw numbers, like he averaged 28.4 points, 9.7 assists per game, led the league, of course, in total points, total assists. Like those numbers are just stand on their own. Like you cannot fake leading the entire league in total points and total assists. Like you have to be really good in order to do that. Also, but even efficiency wise, like he was the best he's ever been across the board. He had the best field goal percentage of his career, best 3-point percentage of his career, 2-point percentage, free throw percentage, EFG, true shooting, all of that stuff was the best of his career all the way across the board. He also took more threes last year. It was not a career high in that, but after a little bit of something at least I worried about a touch the year before when there was a lot of talk about him taking less threes. He took more last year. Not quite to the level of 2 years ago, but still plenty of eight per game. That's obviously quite a bit. And then also, hilariously now in retrospect, he was 4th in the NBA in total free throw attempts last year. You and I are old enough to remember the panic about the rule changes and how he was going to never be able to get to the line anymore. He got to the line a little bit less than he did previously, but when you're 4th in the NBA in total free throw attempts, I think that's not going to be a problem for you moving on from here.
Right.
Also, like led the league in assist rate. That's another thing that he's obviously been doing for a while, but was number 1 in the league there. A career best turnover rate. He had usage rates that were sky high. We could probably come back to like the advanced stuff, but like it really is true. Like even in just like the regular box score and like slightly advanced numbers, how good he was. And again, like I think it got kind of overlooked because it wasn't quite the same like counting stats as 2 years before that, and the Hawks weren't quite as good. But that was not because of him on offense. Like we could argue about whether he was like used perfectly in the system, which I guess we probably can do on this show. But like him individually, the way he produced is like kind of above reproach. I'm not sure how much you can criticize that.
Yeah, I mean, totally. It's when you think about tripling his workload in isolation, leading the league in off the dribble 3-point attempts, and then to elevate his efficiency numbers, and the Hawks having the lowest turnover mark in the league.
In the league,
I mean,
yep.
That's just crazy stuff, for him to be able to kind of do that, And when you look at, okay, well, how did this factor into wins and losses? I think most people would agree like the biggest team kind of theme there was the defense. But, when you talk about him being fourth in the league in free throw attempts, okay, that sounds fine. But, basically, I think the way that plays out, it not being a little higher, is like the best 3 to 5 defenses in the league are just not going to foul him. Like that's what it takes to be a top 5 defense, is to be disciplined in these phases. And we saw in that Miami series, he just couldn't get to the free throw line in that series at all. And so if you're going to go beat teams with a second-rate offense that were last year, you're going into a game where you're facing one of the top-rated defenses in the league. That's going to show up, right? He's going to have 4 free throw attempts instead of 8 or 10 or something like that. That's a big factor in an outcome. And then the other thing I would point to is fourth quarter and clutch, right? And I mean, I have every bit of confidence that he can perform late in games. He's willing to take shots. He's willing to create his shot. He's willing to kind of do all that sort of stuff. But he's a small guy, and without the help, I think it's easy for one who watches the team game to game to see he's just generally wearing down across games because of the workload. Without the drop coverage last year, everything was required more work to kind of get to what he produced, even as a wildly impressive as that was. And so for me is, what can the Hawks do? What can he do to kind of generate kind of shots at the free throw line against top defenses? And then how can they help him save a little bit of gas for the end of games? And I think that's the thing that I kind of look for around where to get better, and where to become a more impactful player, especially in terms of how close games kind of work themselves out in going into the next season.
Yeah, and I do want to zoom back out in a second, but since you mentioned the playoff series, let's just take a minute now and talk about this. I know this is not the most fun topic for Hawks fans in particular, but and listen, we just sort of established how good Trae is. This is not us saying that Trae is terrible or anything like that. Trae's awesome, but he was not good in that playoff series, and he was not alone. Let's just be clear about that. There were a lot of Hawks issues. There were a lot of injury issues. People might forget this now, but between Bogey being kind of hobbled, Collins having 2 injuries, and Capella being not himself in that series, the Hawks were basically down, at least limited in 3 of their best players, plus, the lack of help just overall from Trae. And you're playing a great defense. Like you said with Miami, they were really good defensively last year, et cetera. But just to kind of recap it, it's been a little while now, but he averaged 15 points a game in that series, 6 assists. Not like ridiculously terrible, but not his normal stuff. He had more turnovers than assists in the series. He shot 32% from the floor and took less than 14 shots per game. And just for reference, he took about 20 shots per game in the 3 seasons combined before that. So like just getting shots off was difficult for Trae. He was 7 of 38 from 3. That's obviously terrible as well. And this is the big one. The offense, not the defense, the offense was worse with Trae on the floor in that series. Now, it's a 5-game sample, but that never happens. The Hawks have famously been so much better with Trae on the floor for the last basically 3 full seasons because the backup point guard situation has been terrible, and he's been awesome and all that stuff. But if anything, maybe the defense is better when he sits. It was the offense that was just terrible with him on the floor in that playoff series. And I said this a little bit with Nate Duncan actually recently on a podcast I did with him. But like, I actually think that he actually got less negative attention than I would have thought for as bad as he was in that series. I was pleasantly surprised that there wasn't like the total panic about Trae. And I think it was because of the year before that, because he had been so good in leading them to the conference finals the year before that. But the way that I put it was like, basically, what if that had been his first playoff exposure and he had been that bad? Can you imagine the takes, Glenn? If that had been his first playoff series, the takes would have been incredible. In a negative fashion. Like I would have been like pushing back all summer long about how ridiculous these takes are. And like, I was kind of, again, like pleasantly surprised that it wasn't this whole conversation, because I don't think there really has to be one, to be honest. I think Trae has proven to be in this awesome player. I don't think you panic about that. But at the same time, like it was really bad. And I think that's like, you can't just like throw it away as nothing. And maybe that's part of the reason why they went and got Murray. But what do you make of all that? Like just acknowledging like, yeah, it was a 5-game sample size, but guys with at his stature, like you can go through it. And I'm not going to do the whole thing now, but I kind of went through this after the playoff series. There are not very many like comparisons to guys having these numbers that were this bad that are as good as Trae Young is. And again, it's a high bar because he is so good. But normally, guys that do what he does like do not produce at that kind of level for even one playoff series.
Yeah, it's interesting now that, especially now that we have some distance from it, right?
Yeah,
Kind of look back and like, how do I feel about that
it's
now?
easier in August.
Yeah, what did I learn? What can we learn kind of from that? And for me, the first thing is, how much do I want to call his individual performance bad, right? It wasn't good, so that's not debatable.
It was not.
But when you think about how Miami was kind of loading up against him, and the fact that I still think that Hawks fans underappreciate how much offensive value Clint Capella has as a partner with Trae. We've heard Trae talk about it this past offseason about how important Capella is to him and things like that. I think Capella is the most nuanced screen setter. And I've said before a million times, people are probably tired of hearing me saying it. I think it was brilliant to trade for him because of the billion pick and rolls he'd run with Harden in Houston and how much kind of nuance comes with that. And if you know anything about Harden, he's extremely vocal about where he wants his teammates and what kind of help, and when he wants help and when he wants to screen, when he doesn't want to screen. And credit to Capella for just kind of soaking all that up. And credit to Travis for trading for him and giving Trae just a phenomenal, kind of pick and roll partner. Well, Clint's absence to start the series, I think, just opened the door more so for Miami to kind of really bring more pressure, put it in Trae's face. And so part of me is, do I want to just say Trae was bad? Do I want to say Nate and the coaching staff didn't really come up with any sort of solutions for that? Fair to think also, what were the solutions given how undermanned they were and how they kind of entered that series with, kind of injury issues and things like that. So you definitely don't want to throw it away because, from my coaching background, I'm like, there's always something to learn. There's always something to take away. I talk about playoffs, especially a team's first few times into the playoffs being an opportunity for feedback loops around what can we do, what can't we do in a playoff context. And I continue to think back to, okay, let me contrast this Miami series to especially the Philly series and the Knicks series the prior season, right? Philly has Embiid. That season, they were married to deep drop coverage. That's what Dips does too, right? And so in some ways, like when you look back to the Knicks, like the Hawks on defense matched up really, really well because the Knicks just didn't have that much ball handling, that much shot creation, especially when Derrick Rose was on the court. And the Hawks looked better defensively than they were. Well, I think we have to say now, the same is true offensively, that, what kind of point of attack defenders did Philly have to throw at Trae, right? What kind of point of attack defenders did the Knicks have to throw at Trae? So I don't want to take credit away from Trae. He was phenomenal during that run. But I think if we're trying to kind of learn something, we look at like, okay, deep drop Philly, deep drop New York. Bud mixed it up more with Milwaukee, and we saw that kind of impacts a little bit up and down in that series. And then we go into Spo in Miami, and he's like, I'm just going to throw 3 defenders above the free throw line on every single possession, give Trae absolutely no room. If you ever caught the mic of Spo kind of coaching from the side, from the bench, you would always hear him with Trae Springer over all the way. He was screaming, deny. Do not let him get a single crease. Don't let him get anywhere. And I think that the takeaway can't be, well, Trae didn't have enough help and he couldn't do anything with what Miami had. And that's what, if they're ever going to make a run for a title, they're going to see that exact defensive scheme that Miami threw at them. The league is not going to go, oh, we're not going to do. No, it was wildly successful against Trae. And so for me, the major learning is the Hawks have to have a plan for when they see that, especially in the postseason. And it has to be a wildly different plan, a wildly different solution set than what we saw against Miami. So I personally don't get too spun up around Trae was bad. I think Trae and his coaching staff and the team in general have to kind of cultivate a plan where they can attack that kind of defensive scheme and that kind of defensive roster and have a way to punish the amount of aggressiveness that opposing defense is showing high on the floor against Trae. So that's more of my takeaway. I have no less confidence in Trae after that series than I did before that series. My question more is around, okay, how do you develop a roster and an offensive scheme and a plan to attack that when you see it? Because they're going to have to be able to do that to ever kind of make a true run of the title.
We're on the same page really with that. I think that I was making it even clear in the moment, and we have the benefit of hindsight now as well. Like, I was not worried about Trae. It didn't really impact my opinion of him. I think that the only time that I was a little bit like, maybe not miffed or whatever you want to say it was, like, I thought he kind of gave up late in that series. But I understand why, because nothing was working, and they were beat, and it was kind of like very obvious that it's a very natural thing in a lot of ways. I thought he kind of let go of the rope a little bit, but a lot of guys did, and they were so beat up, and I get all that. But I'm with you. I think it's more like necessarily maybe a little bit concerning, like, of what the plan is the next time that happens, more so than, like, you and I agreed, like, they were never going to make a run in the playoffs last year. That was not likely. We had seen them because we had seen them the year before make that run. We weren't like closing the door on it, because look, if everything clicked, they had the upside. We kind of knew that, but it also was like, people have to remember this. They were a play-in team that had been under 500 most of the season and playing the number one seed. Like, you're not supposed to win that series. Like, you're supposed to lose that series in 5 games. That's what happens. Now it was kind of ugly at times, but yeah, I don't think my opinion really changed about Trae whatsoever. It's just more like, just a little bit of a red flag. And I'm sure, knowing him, not that we're best friends, but knowing him and following basically everything he said since he became a professional basketball player, that's going to, I'm sure, motivate him. I'm sure he did not enjoy himself in that series. And not that he needs a little bit of extra use, because Trae famously works very hard and is very self-motivated. But I think, if anything, he probably heard a lot of that and knows, like, what he wants to fix and what he's going to work on. And him and Nate were talking about that in a personal meeting between, sort of the end of the season and the draft and all that stuff. I think they're not going to rest on their laurel. I think Trae is not going to just, like, slump his shoulders and go back. I think he'll be go back to the drawing board. I'm pretty confident.
Yeah. And I mean, and this is that we know he wants to be the best, and that's not what that looks like. That's not what it looks like to do that. So that he's not going to be satisfied with, oh, well, we had a rough series, move on. I don't think that's the mindset at all. I think he's going to want to attack that with the right kind of help and support. So I'm right there with you. I kind of can't wait to see it next time, because I have so much confidence that he's going to have something else to throw at that. And as he continues to mature, also talking with Nate, this is what I need. Talking with his teammates, this is what I need. This is what I want to see, and those things. And so I'm frankly looking forward to the next time it happens, and I have no doubt it'll go better. How much better, we'll have to see. But I have no doubt it'll go better next time.
For sure. And I do want to get to the sort of the look ahead aspect in a second. I do want to just kind of put a point on this, though. From last year, as we kind of wrap up last season in general, this is a guy, and I think that, locally people understand this, but for anybody else listening to this, like, Trae was seen by 2 of the more respected, like, catch-all metrics, EPM and Raptor, as the number 2 offensive player in the NBA last year, behind only Nikola Jokic, who is, of course, the 2-time reigning MVP. That's how good Trae has been offensively. And with that, even with his bad defense, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, he was like a top 15 player in the league last year by those metrics, even with some of the worst defensive metrics in the league. So, like, we kind of know the deal. I think it's not like breaking news to anyone that he's an awesome offensive player that struggles on defense. But, like, it really is the case where, like, if you're in a league that has Giannis, in a league that has Embiid and everybody else that had great years last year, to be, like, kind of in your own tier behind only Jokic in offense last year, and have that be, like, reasonable for people that watch. Like, I watched every minute he played last year, and that seems reasonable to me, which is crazy. That's just how good he actually is. But even with the Hawks were famously not very good last year defensively, and by proxy overall, they had a 117 offensive rating, which ran the floor last year, Glenn. Like, and it wasn't like they had uber elite personnel. Like, they had pretty good personnel at times offensively in particular, but, like, 117 is 117. And our friends at Clean the Glass, by the way, had the Hawks as being about almost 6 points better per 100 with him on the floor versus off the floor last year. That tells the story as well. And that gap was actually smaller than the year before. The year before, it was like 12 or whatever it was, when they just had nothing behind him. Last year was kind of similar fate. But I just wanted to at least lay that stuff out, because I had it, and it's like, just to kind of put a point. We kind of did the up and down on this conversation. Like, by the way, he was awesome last year. Yes, the team struggled in the playoffs, but again, reminder, he was really, really good last year.
Yeah, for sure. For even him, I don't throw this out because of the trade, but like for him to finish ahead of Luka. Luka had an incredible offensive season last year. If you even kind of look on like what Luka produces on drives, like literally no one, not even Jock, can produce that kind of efficiency because of his size and how
He's so big.
crafty he is working down towards the rim and all that sort of stuff. Trey kind of made up for it in his pull-up shooting that Luka doesn't have and things like that. But just to think about the season Luka had last year and that Trey ranked better in a lot of the advanced offensive metrics tells you everything you know. It's just it's a wild. I go back to thinking about my expectations when he came into the league. You talk about a person who's hitting on their 98th, 99th percentile outcome or whatever, and maybe that was just a little bit too low or whatever, but it's crazy to use Trey's favorite word. It's crazy, all the numbers he puts up, the efficiency, how he keeps adding and growing and things like that. He had he's a historically great offensive player so far, in his time in the league, and what a treat to get to watch him all the time.
Yeah, it's absolutely right, and it is kind of ironic, like how similar their profiles are. They're obviously different players, size wise and approach wise, and all that stuff. But a lot of those structural blind item kind of comparisons, it ends up being Trey and Luka that have kind of unique profiles,
Right.
as especially usage wise. They are by far the number 1 and 2 guys in usage and some of the more advanced metrics. I know I was talking to Josh Lloyd recently on his show on Locked On Fantasy, and he kind of had this blind item who's the number 1 player in this catch-all, basically offense is built around the one player, and it's Trey and Luka in some order in all of those
Right.
metrics. It's just really interesting after all this conversation, all this time, that they are 2 of the unique talents in the league. So there you go. All right, that will do it for part 1 between myself and Glenn. And as a reminder, part 2 is available right now in your podcast feed. It's episode 1300 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. We'll have more on Trey with regard to looking ahead to this season, DeJounte Murray fit, all that fun stuff. So please keep it locked here. Please subscribe to the podcast. Follow Glenn on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. Follow the show on Twitter as well at Locked On Hawks. And we'll see you next time.